The construction workers stood there, looking at each other in confusion. The fence clearly stated that the area was private property, and yet, here they were, ready to start building a playground as per their instructions. It was clear that they were hesitant, unsure whether they should proceed with the project or not. They had likely been sent by the HOA under false pretenses, unaware that the land didn't actually belong to them. The signs were unmistakable, yet the workers probably assumed that the HOA had already handled whatever legal matters were necessary to proceed. They were just there to do their job. I could only imagine the frustration they must have felt, realizing that they had potentially been misled. I actually felt bad for them. It wasn't their fault that the HOA was acting shady, and they were probably just trying to earn their wages. Those poor guys were most likely told that the land had been cleared for development, but now, standing before a fence that clearly marked private property, they had no idea what to do next. I didn't interact with them that day, but I'm sure they must have reported the situation back to the HOA. Whatever they were told next must have been enough for them to pack up and leave, because the very next day, I found out they had been ordered to abandon the project entirely. The situation didn't just end there, though. The following morning, I was met with an all-too-familiar sight. Karen, one of the most insufferable members of the HOA, standing at my front door with an expression of absolute rage. She was fuming, her face red with anger, and before I could even say a word, she demanded an explanation. "Why did you put up that fence?" she snapped, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. It was as if she believed she had complete authority over my property, and the very idea that I had done something without consulting her first seemed to infuriate her. I calmly explained that I had put up the fence to prevent unauthorized people from trespassing. Of course, this only made her angrier. "And why would you do that?" she shot back. "That pond is meant for community use." Her voice was rising with every word, but I simply shook my head. That was where she was wrong. I made it clear that the pond was not, and had never been, part of the HOA's jurisdiction. No matter how much they wanted to disregard the legal deed, the fact remained that my father had purchased that land separately from the house, and it was entirely mine. Karen refused to accept this reality. "You have no right to do what you're doing," she shouted, practically shaking with fury. "The HOA will sue you for this." I could have tried to reason with her, but honestly, I was beyond done with their nonsense. Instead, I smirked and crossed my arms. "Go ahead and sue me," I challenged her. "See how that works out for you." Karen looked stunned for a moment, as if she couldn't believe I had the audacity to stand my ground. Without another word, she stormed off, clearly determined to follow through on her threat. Sure enough, just a few days later, I was served with a lawsuit. It didn't surprise me, but what did amuse me was how weak their case was. I had already contacted a lawyer before, just in case the HOA ever tried to pull something like this, and I immediately got back in touch with her. She was more than willing to take them on. When the court date arrived, the HOA argued that because my main residence was within their jurisdiction, they had full control over my property, including the pond. However, my lawyer effortlessly dismantled their case. She presented undeniable evidence showing that the pond and the house were two separate properties. She even had the original deed proving that my father had purchased the land separately, making it clear that the HOA never had any rights to it in the first place. The final blow came when my lawyer reviewed the entire HOA contract and its clauses. She had gone the extra mile and managed to find the complete document on their website. After going through it thoroughly, she pointed out something crucial. The clause that Karen had been referring to, the one that supposedly gave the HOA control over my pond, simply did not exist. The HOA had been bluffing the entire time. They had no legal standing to take the pond, and they had essentially built the playground on private property without permission. The judge didn't take long to make a decision. The ruling was completely in my favor, and the HOA was ordered to remove everything they had constructed around the pond. Because they had built everything illegally, they wouldn't be receiving any compensation for the materials they had used. It was a brutal loss for them, and I'm sure it stung even more knowing that they had spent all that money for nothing. Within a week, the area was completely cleared out. Everything they had built was gone, and my pond was finally back to the way it had been before they ever set foot on it. Of course, there was one thing that couldn't be restored: the trees. The HOA had cut down several beautiful trees around the pond, and that was something that truly upset me. Those trees had been there for decades, adding to the natural beauty of the area, and now they were gone because of the HOA's reckless actions. It was a loss that couldn't simply be undone, no matter how much compensation they were ordered to pay me. Sure, I received a fair settlement in court, but money couldn't bring back the trees that had been destroyed. Still, I wasn't going to let their destruction be in vain. I've since dedicated my time to nurturing the land and planting new trees, hoping that one day, the area will return to its former beauty. It will take years, probably longer than I'll be around to see, but what matters is that the pond is now protected. No one will ever be able to touch it again. In the meantime, I've also started focusing on my own projects. I've begun building a small cabin by the pond, something simple but functional. It has a kitchen, a dining area, and a small resting space. I've also built a shed for my fishing supplies. Now, with the HOA completely out of the picture, I can finally get back to what I love, enjoying my land in peace. As the days passed, I finally started to feel a sense of peace that had been missing ever since the HOA first tried to take control of my land. For so long, I had been dealing with their ridiculous attempts to claim ownership, and now that the court had ruled in my favor, it was like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The pond was mine, just as it had always been, and no one could take that away from me. Still, I couldn't help but feel a lingering bitterness over what had happened. The trees they destroyed were irreplaceable, and though I had received financial compensation, it didn't make up for what was lost. The area looked bare without them, and every time I glanced at the empty spaces where they once stood, I felt a pang of frustration. Those trees had been part of my childhood, part of the land's natural beauty, and the fact that they had been cut down so thoughtlessly was something that would always bother me. But instead of dwelling on what I had lost, I chose to focus on rebuilding. I planted as many new trees as I could, knowing it would take decades for them to grow to their full size. It was a slow process, but at least I was doing something to restore what had been taken away, and in the meantime, I shifted my attention to another project, constructing a proper cabin near the pond. It had always been a dream of mine to have a small getaway spot where I could relax and enjoy the quietness of nature, and now that I had won my case, there was nothing stopping me. The cabin was simple but functional. I designed it with a small kitchen, a dining area, and a cozy space to rest after a long day of fishing. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was exactly what I needed. I also built a shed nearby to store all my fishing gear, so everything would be easily accessible whenever I wanted to head out onto the water. Working on the cabin gave me a sense of purpose. It felt good to be creating something positive after everything that had happened with the HOA. Every nail I hammered into place, every board I secured, was another step toward reclaiming the peace they had tried to take from me. By the time I finished, I felt more satisfied than I had in a long time. The cabin stood as a symbol of my victory, proof that I had fought back against those who tried to take what was mine, and that I had won. It wasn't long before I started settling back into my old routine. I had taken a break from fishing while dealing with a legal battle, but now that everything had been resolved, I was eager to get back to it. There was something deeply calming about casting a line into the water, listening to the gentle sounds of nature, and waiting patiently for a catch. It was one of the simple pleasures in life that I had always cherished. The pond, despite everything it had been through, was still teeming with life. Fish darted beneath the surface, birds nested in the remaining trees, and small animals roamed freely along the water's edge. It was a reminder that no matter how much damage the HOA had caused, nature had a way of enduring. I spent my days enjoying the solitude, appreciating the land that I had fought so hard to protect. There was no longer any fear that someone would come along and try to take it from me. I was finally able to relax, knowing that my home and my pond were truly mine. Of course, the HOA didn't take their loss well. Even though the court had ruled in my favor, I could tell that Karen and the rest of the board were seething over their defeat. They had wasted time, effort, and money on a case they were never going to win, and now they had nothing to show for it. It must have been humiliating for them to be proven so publicly wrong. But what could they do? They had no legal ground to stand on, and they knew it. I noticed that Karen avoided me whenever we crossed paths in the neighborhood, which was fine by me. I had no interest in speaking to her or anyone else from the HOA ever again. As far as I was concerned, they no longer existed. The best part was that they were completely powerless to interfere with my land ever again. No more threats, no more lawsuits, no more ridiculous demands. They had tried to control something that was never theirs, and they had failed spectacularly. That was the end of it. With the HOA out of my life for good, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced in years. I could finally enjoy my home and my land without constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering what scheme they were going to pull next. The battle was over, and I had won. The trees they destroyed would take time to grow back, but I was patient. I had the rest of my life to watch them flourish. In the meantime, I focused on making the most of what I had. My cabin was finished, my fishing gear was ready, and my pond was exactly as it should be, untouched by anyone but me. I took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp, fresh air, and smiled. This was my land, my home, my sanctuary. No one could take that away from me. And no matter what the HOA had tried to do, they had failed. They would never bother me again. Initially, employees were allowed to take company vans home after work, which was convenient for those who were on call. However, a major policy shift occurred when a managerial decision required all vans to be returned to the office at the end of each shift. This meant that employees who previously had the flexibility to take the vans home for emergency callouts now had to drive back to the facility first, collect the van, complete their service call, and then return the van before heading home in their personal vehicles. This change added extra travel time, increased fuel costs, and created unnecessary hassle for workers who were already putting in long hours. The policy was met with frustration from the employees, as it disrupted the long-standing system that had been in place for years and worked efficiently for everyone involved. Employees saw the decision as a poorly thought-out move that only served to complicate their work-life balance, rather than improve company efficiency. Unsurprisingly, the new policy was met with significant backlash from employees who relied on the previous system's convenience. Some workers, in a show of defiance or sheer practicality, went out and purchased larger personal vehicles, claiming that they could no longer accommodate the company vans at home. While this might have been a legitimate concern for a few, it seemed like many used it as an excuse to resist reverting to the old system, even when the policy was later reversed. This level of resistance highlighted the depth of dissatisfaction among employees, proving that once workplace privileges are taken away, it becomes much harder to reinstate them without lingering resentment. Workers were not willing to easily forgive or forget the inconvenience they had been subjected to, and as a result, they continued to follow the newer, more cumbersome routine instead of reverting to the previous arrangement. Despite the policy reversal, the damage had already been done. Employees, feeling wronged by the initial decision, decided to maintain the new routine out of sheer stubbornness and principle. Instead of taking the vans home as they once did, they opted to drive their personal cars to the facility, pick up the company vans, complete their callouts, return the vans, and then drive back home in their own vehicles. This process, while unnecessarily complicated, became the new normal simply because employees no longer wanted to give in to the company's flip-flopping decisions. They had found a way to make the situation work for them while still expressing their dissatisfaction with management's poor decision-making. While this system required more effort and additional trips, the workers were determined to stick with it rather than be forced back into another policy change at management's whim. The frustration with the company's handling of the situation was evident in the employees' collective decision to resist returning to the old way of doing things, proving that workplace morale and trust had been severely damaged. While the new system may have been a hassle, employees found a silver lining: the extra pay that came with it. Because of the additional time spent driving back and forth, workers were compensated for the inconvenience, which made the new routine somewhat worthwhile. The unintended consequence of the company's poor decision-making was that employees were now getting paid for the extra time they spent retrieving and returning the vans. This added financial benefit meant that, even though the process was inefficient, workers were at least making extra money because of it. In some cases, this additional compensation made up for the inconvenience and even made it more desirable than the original system. Ironically, what started as a frustrating policy change ended up benefiting the employees financially, further solidifying their decision to continue with the new method rather than going back to the old way of doing things. The company, in trying to cut costs and enforce a stricter policy, inadvertently created a situation where employees ended up making more money than before, making it clear that management had not fully thought through the financial implications of their decision. As with any major workplace blunder, someone had to take the fall. In this case, it was Mr. Tidewood, the individual responsible for implementing the van policy change. After months of frustration, complaints, and inefficiencies caused by the new system, word got around that Mr. Tidewood had quietly disappeared from the corporate directory. It was heavily implied that he had been let go, likely as a result of the backlash his decision had caused. The senior accountant who had supported his policy change didn't escape unscathed either. Though he wasn't fired, he was demoted to a more junior role, effectively removing him from any position of influence within the company. This served as a clear warning to other managers: poor decision-making that directly affects employees' work routines and morale would not be tolerated. While the company may have suffered losses due to this debacle, employees took satisfaction in seeing the higher-ups face consequences for their actions. It was a rare instance where employee frustration led to real change, reinforcing the idea that management decisions should always consider the workers' needs before implementing major policy shifts. Shifting gears from the corporate van fiasco, the story transitions to an entirely different setting, a retail craft store where an employee encounters an unruly customer and her children. The store, like many others specializing in arts and crafts, had shelves stocked with fragile, breakable, and sharp items. Glass figurines, ceramic decorations, and delicate ornaments filled the aisles, making it a dangerous place for unsupervised children to run around. On this particular day, the employee was stocking one of these precarious sections when a woman entered the store with what initially seemed like an army of children. In reality, it was only 4, but their chaotic energy made it feel like 10. Without a second thought, the mother let them loose as if the store were a playground, allowing them to sprint through the aisles playing games like tag and Marco Polo. As the children darted around, oblivious to the hazards around them, they became a serious safety risk, to themselves, to other customers, and to the employee trying to do their job. Having worked in retail for a long time, the employee knew that directly confronting the mother would likely backfire. Many parents, when asked to control their children in public places, react with defensiveness or hostility rather than compliance. Instead of making a direct request and risking an argument, the employee decided to take a more strategic approach. They casually positioned themselves near the mother while pretending to restock items and then spoke into their work headset, without actually pressing the button to transmit the message, so that only the mother could hear. They fabricated a message about broken glass in aisle 13, implying that there was a real danger in letting children run wild. By making it seem like an announcement to coworkers rather than a direct request to the customer, the employee cleverly shifted the mother's perception of the situation. Rather than feeling like she was being scolded, the woman suddenly became aware of a potential hazard she had previously ignored. The tactic worked like a charm. As soon as the woman overheard the mention of broken glass, her demeanor changed. The idea that her children might be running straight into a dangerous situation, one where they could get injured or, worse, she could be held responsible for damages, snapped her out of her oblivious state. Without hesitation, she rounded up her kids and kept them close by her side for the rest of the shopping trip. Gone were the echoes of Marco and Polo, bouncing off the store walls. The chaotic running and shouting were replaced with a newfound sense of caution. The employee, meanwhile, continued stocking the shelves with a satisfied sense of victory, knowing they had successfully restored order without having to engage in a confrontation. The brilliance of the move was in its subtlety. The mother had no idea she had been manipulated into compliance, making it an ideal solution for dealing with similar situations in the future. Recognizing how well the trick had worked, the employee began using it regularly whenever customers treated the store like free childcare. Whenever children were running wild, all it took was a well-placed fake announcement about broken glass to make parents suddenly concerned about their kids' safety. According to the employee, this method was successful approximately 90% of the time. It became an invaluable tool in their customer service arsenal, allowing them to manage disruptive behavior without conflict. Retail employees often have to deal with difficult situations without much authority to enforce rules, so finding clever workarounds like this can make their jobs significantly easier. The fact that it worked so often speaks volumes about how people's behavior can be influenced simply by making them perceive a risk, even if that risk isn't real. By using indirect persuasion rather than direct confrontation, the employee had discovered an ingenious way to keep the store safer and more manageable. After wrapping up the 2 main workplace stories, the video encourages viewers to engage by leaving star emojis in the comments. This is a common strategy used by content creators to boost engagement on their videos. Platforms like YouTube prioritize videos with high interaction rates, meaning that more comments, likes, and shares help push the content to a wider audience. By asking viewers to leave something as simple as a star emoji, the creator makes it easy for people to participate without having to type out a full comment. This technique not only increases visibility but also fosters a sense of community among viewers, making them feel involved in the content. The video ends on this note, reinforcing the importance of audience interaction while teasing future stories to keep viewers coming back for more.